20,000 feet, and the world tilts. Then, the roar of 12 cylinders vanishes into a hollow, sucking silence. The most advanced fighter on Earth has just become a 4-ton coffin. It wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a tactical suicide. How did the million-pound spearhead of the British Empire surrender to a simple change in gravity? Why did a machine built to save civilization choke on a single cup of fuel? The generals called it an inevitability. The ministry blamed pilot error. But the answer wasn't in their pristine blueprints. It was in the oil-stained hands of a woman they chose to ignore. They laughed at her racing records while their pilot spiraled toward the channel. Why did the powerful system ignore the only tactic that could save them? The answer wasn't in the classified vaults, but in the hands of the underdog. The air over the English Channel in August of 1940 does not feel like a battlefield. At 20,000 feet, it is a cathedral of cold blue glass, infinite and deceptively peaceful. But inside the cockpit of a Spitfire, the peace is a lie. There is the constant, vibrating thrum of the Merlin engine, 12 cylinders of Rolls-Royce Fury, and the sharp, metallic tang of high-octane fuel. The pilot is a boy, barely 20, his face masked by rubber and oxygen. He is strapped into the most advanced fighter in the world. He is told he is invincible. He spots a Messerschmitt Bf 109, a jagged yellow-nosed predator. The German pilot sees him too. They dance, a frantic, spiraling waltz of lead and aluminum. The British pilot gains the advantage. He moves into the killing zone. He is seconds away from a victory that will be celebrated in the evening papers. The German pilot knows he is beaten. He sees the only thing he can. He pushes the nose of his plane straight down, diving toward the churning gray waters of the channel. To follow him, the British pilot must do the same. He pushes his control column forward. He prepares for the rush of adrenaline. But instead, he feels the cold hand of a mechanical betrayal. As the nose of the Spitfire drops, negative gravity, negative G, takes hold of the aircraft. Inside the engine's belly, the carburetor is doing exactly what it was designed to do, but it is doing it in a world that has been turned upside down. The mechanism is simple, much like the float in a toilet tank. A small chamber holds a pool of fuel, regulated by a floating needle. But as the plane noses over, that pool of fuel is flung to the top of the chamber. The needle is forced shut. For a heartbeat, the engine is starved. Then, the opposite happens. The chamber floods, drenching the cylinders in raw, unburnt petrol. The engine chokes, like a swimmer suddenly hit by a rogue wave mid-breath. The roar of the Merlin cuts to a terrifying, hollow silence. The propeller windmills fruitlessly against the rushing air. The Spitfire is no longer a hunter. It is a 4-ton glider drifting helplessly while the enemy disappears into the haze. This isn't a malfunction. It isn't a glitch. It is a fatal blind spot in British engineering. The German pilots know this. They call it the English disease. They know that if they simply dive, the mighty Spitfire will choke on its own blood. Down in the hangars, the mechanics see the result. They see the soot-stained exhaust and the pilots returning with trembling hands, their eyes wide with the shock of a narrow escape. They report it. They scream it up the chain of command. But the message hits a wall of polished mahogany and brass buttons. The Air Ministry is a gentleman's club of theory and tradition. To them, The Spitfire is a masterpiece. To admit it has a flaw is to admit that the system itself is broken. They claim that the disaster is impossible because the manual says the engine is optimized for combat. They formulated a collective mindset that prioritized the procedure over the man. Their logic was cold. The Spitfire is the pinnacle of aviation. If the engine fails during a maneuver, it is not the machine that is flawed. It is the pilot who has exceeded the aircraft's intended limits. They told the young men dying in the clouds that they simply needed to learn to fly differently. They suggested a roll into the dive maneuver, a complex, time-consuming roll that would keep positive G on the plane. In a dogfight where life is measured in fractions of a second, the ministry was asking their pilots to perform a ballet while a German ace was aiming a cannon at their spine. While the generals debated the cost of redesigning the fuel system, a process they estimated would take a year, and ground the entire RAF, a quiet resistance was forming in the shadows of the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Among the draftsmen and the theoreticians, there was an outsider, a woman who spent her weekends hurtling around the Brooklands racetrack on a Norton motorcycle at 100 miles an hour. She didn't care for the gentleman's way of doing things. She understood the visceral, dirty reality of engines under pressure. Her name was Beatrice Shilling. But to the men who would eventually owe her their lives, she was simply Tilly. While the establishment screamed in panic and shuffled papers, Tilly was already in the dark of the workshop, holding the silence that would save them. She wasn't looking at the massive blueprints of the Merlin engine. She was looking at a single fuel line. She saw what the experts missed, that the most complex problems don't always require a complex solution. Sometimes they just require someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty. The Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough is a world of echoing hangars and the smell of old paper. A place where the life and death struggle of the skies is reduced to equations on a chalkboard. While the Air Ministry in London continues to debate the theoretical impossibility of a quick fix, the workshop floor is a theater of frustration. The senior engineers, men who have spent decades perfecting the slow, methodical evolution of flight, move with a ponderous weight. They are looking for a masterpiece of a solution, a complete redesign of the carburetor that would require a symphony of new parts, new supply lines, and a year of testing. They are looking for a mountain when they only need a pebble. In the corner of this world, Beatrice Shilling stands at her workbench. She is an anomaly in a grease-stained boiler suit. To the men around her, she is a curiosity, a lady engineer, whose presence is tolerated because of the desperation of the hour. They see her working on the fuel lines of a Merlin engine, and they offer polite, condescending smiles. "Focus on the secondary cooling systems, Miss Shilling," a chief designer says, his voice thick with the practiced patience of the establishment. The fuel delivery issues are being handled by the senior board. It's a matter of fluid dynamics far beyond the scope of a field repair. He treats the disaster like a philosophical puzzle. He prioritizes the sanctity of the original design over the lives of the boys currently spiraling into the channel. But Tilly isn't listening to the board. She is listening to the machine. Her perspective is not born in a classroom, but on the concrete banking of the Brooklands racetrack. When you are leaning a Norton motorcycle into a turn at 100 miles an hour, you don't have time for a committee. You don't care about the sanctity of design. You care about the ghost in the machine, the way the fuel sloshes in the tank, the way the vibration tells you exactly where the metal is about to scream. Because Tilly was a racer, she saw the problem differently than the experts. While the board saw a complex failure of the entire fuel system, she saw a simple, violent surge. While they saw complexity, she saw a pattern. She realized that the engine didn't need a new heart. It just needed a throat that knew how to swallow. She picks up a piece of scrap brass. It is nothing more than a small circular disc. She begins to work it on the lathe. The metal shaves off in golden curls. She drills a single, precise hole in the center. This is the black box of the Battle of Britain. The logic is insultingly simple. The restrictor is a small brass thimble, a washer fitted directly into the fuel line. It acts like a nozzle on a garden hose, limiting the flow to the exact maximum the engine can actually consume. When the plane noses over and the fuel surges, the tsunami of petrol hits the washer and is forced to wait its turn. It cannot flood the engine because the hole simply won't let it. It is a fix that costs less than a penny, and it renders the English disease extinct. But a solution is only as good as the system that allows it. Tilly knows that if she submits this through the proper channels, it will be buried under 3 months of paperwork and peer reviews. The gentlemen will find a reason to reject it because it didn't come from them. Tilly Shilling does not wait for the ink to dry on a rejection letter. She understands that in wartime, unauthorized is just another word for effective. She packs a bag with contraband, hundreds of brass washers turned on a rogue lathe, and drives into the blackouts. She isn't visiting airfields. She's infiltrating them. Bypassing the sentries, she moves into the hangars like a saboteur. Every weld she makes is a violation of the King's regulations. Every fix she installs is technically an act of treason against the Air Ministry's blueprints. If she is caught, there will be no medal. There will be a court-martial and a locked cell. But as she crawls into the oil-slicked bellies of the Spitfires, she isn't thinking of prison. She is thinking of the 5-second silence that kills. And she chooses to break the law to save the pilots the law has already abandoned, her hands blackened with grease, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She is a ghost moving through the system, fixing the world's most advanced fighter plane with a piece of brass the size of a thumbnail. While she works in the shadows of the hangars, the Luftwaffe command is growing increasingly confident. Their intelligence reports are clear. The British fighters cannot follow them in a dive. The German aces have begun to treat the gravity cut as a law of nature. They fly with an arrogance born of a perceived physical law. They believe the silence of the British engine is a sign of their own superiority. They treat the English sky as a playground where they hold the only key to the exit. But they have fatally underestimated the woman in the oily boiler suit. They believe they are fighting a system of slow, rigid tradition. They don't realize that the boss, the cold, hard reality of physics, has been reprogrammed. The German pilots are about to dive into a trap they helped build. They think they are pulling the British into a void, but they are actually pulling them into a reckoning. The hammer is cocked. The arrogance of the R.A.E. is about to meet the simple, unyielding truth of a brass washer. and the sky is about to become a very lonely place for anyone wearing a swastika. Spring 1941. The skies over the English Channel are no longer a sanctuary for the Luftwaffe. High above the white cliffs, a German Messerschmitt pilot executes his perfect escape. He sees the shadow of a Spitfire in his rear view, feels the tracer rounds nipping at his wings, and with the calm confidence of a man who knows the rules of the air, he slams the stick forward. He drops his nose into a vertical plunge, expecting the familiar silence of the British engine behind him. He waits for the Spitfire to choke. He waits for the English disease to claim his pursuer. But this time, the silence never comes. Behind him, the Merlin engine does not gasp. It does not flood. It roars. Thanks to a tiny brass thimble, a restrictor no bigger than a wedding ring, the fuel flow remains steady, held in check by the simple physics of Tilly Shilling's orifice. The Spitfire follows the dive with the hunger of a predator that has finally found its teeth. The German pilot looks back, and for the first time, he sees the impossible. The British fighter is closing the gap, its nose pointed straight at him, its 8 machine guns spitting fire. The termed invincible escape maneuver has become a suicide trap. The British pilots return to base, their Merlin engine still ticking with heat, their kill counts doubled. But as they climb out of the cockpits, the high-ranking experts from the ministry are waiting on the tarmac. They aren't there to cheer. They stand in a line, stiff gray men in polished boots, staring at the small, scorched welds on the fuel lines. They see the brass washers. They see the undeniable proof that a woman with a motorcycle toolkit solved the riddle that defeated their collective millions. There is no applause. There is only a heavy, shameful silence. They look at the sky, then at the grease-stained, unauthorized modification, and they walk away without a word. Their humiliation is absolute. They cannot admit she was right, because to do so would be to admit they were the ones who had been killing their own boys all along. But as the tide of the air war turns, the cruel irony of the system begins to take hold. The invention that saved the RAF, the R.A.E. restrictor, was never given a formal, heroic name. Instead, the men who owed their lives to it turned Beatrice Shilling's name into a barracks joke. They called it Miss Shilling's orifice. It was a crude, sexist play on words that reduced a masterpiece of engineering to a punchline in the officer's mess. Tilly didn't care. She didn't seek the medals or the front-page headlines. While the generals and air marshals were being knighted for strategic brilliance, she was back at Farnborough, likely with grease under her fingernails, already looking for the next flaw to fix. She had solved a problem the entire British military establishment claimed was unsolvable, and she had done it with a penny's worth of brass and a refusal to be ignored. The system eventually moved on. By 1943, the carburetor was replaced by fuel injection, rendering the brass washer obsolete. The orifice was phased out, the Spitfires were upgraded, and the story of the woman who saved the Battle of Britain began to gather dust in the archives. Today, we look at the Spitfire as a symbol of national pride, a masterpiece of aesthetic and mechanical perfection. We see it in museums, polished and pristine. But we rarely look close enough to see the small brass washer hidden in the fuel line. We live in a world that still worships the master plan and the grand strategy. We still look to the men in suits and the high-ranking experts to solve our greatest crises. But the story of Beatrice Shilling is a mirror reflecting our own modern hubris. We often mistake complexity for intelligence and rank for wisdom. The orifice was eventually phased out, replaced by shiny new systems and cleaner histories. The system didn't learn, it just upgraded. We like to believe we've outgrown this brand of institutional arrogance, that in our modern world of corporate efficiency and high-level bureaucracy, we listen to the Tillies in the room. We don't. We still prioritize the manual over the man. We still hide our failures behind complex jargon and expensive committees, while the English disease simply changes its name. Today, the Spitfire is a legend. Beatrice Shilling is a footnote. We remember the generals because they wrote the books. We forget the woman because she was too busy fixing their mistakes to ask for the credit. In the end, the system didn't just take her invention, they took her dignity and turned it into a barracks joke. And that is the most enduring engine of all, the one that grinds human genius into silence. It remembers the loud panic of the system, but ignores the quiet competence of the underdog. The victory in the skies over Dover wasn't just won by courage or firepower. It was won by a woman who saw a pattern in the chaos and had the audacity to believe that a simple truth could defeat a massive lie. If you believe that stories like Beatrice Shilling's deserve to be remembered, join our ranks by subscribing and liking this video. Every name we recover from the fog of history is a victory for the truth. We have synthesized this narrative from reputable historical archives and verified sources. However, the fog of war often extends to the history books. If you spot any inaccuracies or have additional details to share, please correct us in the comments. We strive for the absolute truth, and your knowledge helps us get there. Thank you for keeping history alive.